Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered, and contribute to the community forum. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our construction, tech, or weekly Global Passive House Showcase webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Well, welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from home isolation in Auckland, in New Zealand.
Yes, I am Zack Semke. I'm coming to you from Seattle, Washington, and I'm noticing something different about your voice. What's going on with you?
It's my husky radio voice I've been working on for a little
while. There's that, and combined with some nasal sound.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, it's officially day 4, I think, of as we're recording this for me, since my positive test for Omicron. Well, I assume it's Omicron. Yeah, we had a couple of our kids go through last week, and then we're just about to finish our family home isolation, and I got the dreaded 2 red lines. So that's me for the next few days, but. I crawl out of bed this morning, and I'm actually fine, grateful for having a nice house to isolate in, and everything, and vaccines, and being in relatively good health. So all is well where I am, and I'm very grateful for that. But I tell you what, after listening to today's interview, I feel like a different person. I'm very inspired, and I feel more energized, and what an incredible chat. So let's get into that as soon as we can, but we'll thank our sponsors before we do.
Indeed. So a big thank you to our sponsors that make the podcast possible and make everything that we do at Passive House Accelerator happen. So thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minitaire all-in-one HVAC and dehumidification units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwool North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Thank you too to our champion sponsors, Icon Windows and Doors, Proseco, and SIGA. And thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Awesome. Well, I think you do a pretty good job of introducing and trying your hardest to embarrass our guest this week. So in the interview, so I don't know if there's anything you want to say before we play the tape, but or we should just get into it.
No, it was just a privilege to interview Nakita Reed. She's a pretty amazing person. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Well, I am very happy to have Nakita Reed join us for the Passive House podcast. Welcome, Nakita.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So I'm going to start by maybe embarrassing you a little bit with some introductions, because there have been some recent developments, and it's just kind of a cool story. So you're associate at Quinn Evans Architects. You're also co-chair of ZNCC, which is the Zero Net Carbon Collaboration. And that's, I think, how we first interfaced, because Passive House Accelerator is a member group of this collaborative. So that's an organization that aims to rapidly accelerate achievement of zero net carbon for the existing and historic built environments, accounting for both embodied and operational carbon. And it monitors technological development and coordinates best practice for the zero net carbon rehabilitation of existing buildings to facilitate the responsible reuse of built resources, according to your website.
Yes.
You're also a podcast host of your podcast called Tangible Remnants. And that's a podcast where you explore the interconnectedness of architecture, sustainability, historic preservation, race, and gender. In 2018, you won the AIA DC Emerging Architect Award. And then just a couple of weeks ago, you won the 2022 Young Architects Award, a national honor. So here, and I'm going to embarrass you more here. In the words of Constance Lai, a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, Nakita Reed is a true polymath with expertise ranging from historic preservation to sustainability to rewriting history to include the Black experience. She is always looking for connections, whether it's reaching back through history to tell a story about a place, managing a Zoom meeting to discuss how historic buildings can become net zero, or interviewing a fellow architect on her podcast, which is a wonderful quote. So I was hoping that we might start with you sharing about this really amazing confluence of identities and missions that is Nakita Reed. And,
Sure.
And I got a sense for listening to your podcast for this a bit, but I'd love for you to share it with the audience if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction. And it's definitely, embarrassed and I'm blushing over here. But I didn't realize how unique of a vantage point that I have until I got more into the profession. Because when I knew I was going to be an architect early on. I've always had an interest in dilapidated buildings and existing buildings because when I was younger, I didn't understand why there were homeless people sleeping outside of vacant buildings. It seemed like buildings need people, people need buildings. There's a solution there. So I knew from an early age I wanted to go into architecture because I thought architecture was what was going to save the planet, basically, and end homelessness, all of the things. As I know now, and as many people know, it's a more complex issue than that. But starting with the building and just being fascinated with it was something that I knew I was going to go into. And so I went to college, and architecture school didn't really teach too much about existing buildings. It was much more new construction. And so then I ended up going back because I was like, I needed to also learn more about preservation because working with existing buildings is more than just, it's harder, or there's more of a science, there's more to it than I think many architects think it is. So I had the privilege to also intern with a preservation architect in DC and learn more about working with existing buildings. And all the while, even in my undergrad, I was probably one of 3 Black students in my class. And then in graduate, it was about that as well. So I knew that I wasn't meeting that many Black people or people of color in the design profession in architecture school or preservation school. But I kind of thought that was just because of where I was going to school. I was going to predominantly white institutions. So I ended up going to UVA for undergrad and UPenn for graduate school. And so then it wasn't until I got licensed and was meeting other Black architects when I realized that, oh, wait, there's really just not that many of us. And so of the 100,000 licensed architects in the country, something like 2,000 were African-American. And of that 2,000, less than 500 at the time were African-American women. So I started realizing that there weren't that many people who looked like me, who had similar lived experiences, and who were interested in the things that I was interested in. So I realized I needed to actually start using my voice in a way to share more of those stories, particularly even in the sustainability space. It would probably come as no surprise to anyone listening that there's not that many people of color in the passive community and even a lot of the green circles. And a lot of it has to do with a number of things, but also it's messaging to some extent, because some of the things that I've been realizing as I've been having different conversations with both my white colleagues and my Black colleagues is that the way that sustainability has been framed has often been framed as something that affluent people do. Whereas a lot of times, if you're thinking of, for instance, thinking of, and I know I'm going on a long tangent for this intro, but we're going to go with it.
Please. This is perfect.
Yeah. Because even thinking of if you're in a lower income neighborhood and you see a lot of people walking, a lot of times the thought is oh, they're walking because they don't have a car, or they're taking the bus because they can't afford a car, they don't drive, as opposed to being oh, they're doing that because they want to be sustainable. Whereas if you see people taking the bus in a white neighborhood or an affluent neighborhood, you're oh, they care about the planet. So it's it's the same action, but it's framed differently by race and income and class. And so it's being mindful of how we're thinking about sustainability and who's doing what, and just being more mindful of that.
Awesome. And one of the things that you talked about was this, I think you describe yourself as a, I don't know if you use the word connector, but definitely there are at least like different kind of different perspectives and communities that you bring together. And one of those, and maybe identities that you're sort of have one foot in each camp. So with preservationism, or preservationists, I should say, and architects, you describe this funny tension that occurs between. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And so I noticed it. So at grad school, so I did a dual degree, but I had to get into each program separately. And each of the programs are very, they're different programs, different degrees. And so for my architecture colleagues, they saw preservationist and preservation students as one that, because I went to Penn, there was a strong conservation science component of preservation at Penn. So a lot of times we were in lab coats, we were doing things, scientific things. We're dropping acid on different materials to see how they were going to weather and things like that. And so the architects thought that was kind of weird. But then they also had this idea of preservationists wanting to keep things as they were, being hindrances to the design process and not really caring about amazing, beautiful new architecture. Just they want to just, keep things as they are and keep things stagnant. And that's not what preservation is to me at all, or most preservationists. But then I also had preservation friends who were very much like, oh, well, architects don't know how to design anything. Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings leaked, architects are so egotistical and so pompous, whatever. So there was this very weird, a disconnect between the two different professions and then my classmates. And I was like, architects, don't you want to be designing things that preservationists would want to preserve in 50 years? Since in our country, 50 years is kind of the target before something can be considered historic. And I was like, and preservationists, don't you want architects to keep designing new things of this period, of this time, so that in the future, there's still more things to preserve? So it's kind of like this, architects give preservationists a sense of job security because there's going to keep being things that need to be preserved. And so there's definitely this idea that not everything that currently exists needs to be preserved and with the capital P, or, put back to a particular period of time or anything like that, or go back to a particular period of significance. But there definitely is this need to make sure that we're reusing what's here as much as we can because of the sustainability impacts of it, because of the amount of embodied energy that is in the buildings that are already here. And the fact that we're not going to build our way to net zero, we really need to do deep green retrofits of what's already here. And preservationists have a really great understanding of how to work with existing buildings in a way that doesn't just throw them away. Whereas, unfortunately, there are a lot of contractors and a lot of people in the built environment who think that, oh, well, if it's a historic building, it's an energy hog, you'd be better off demolishing it and building something new, something high performing and net zero. But that's not the case most of the time, particularly because that calculus doesn't take into account the impacts of demolition and the carbon impacts of demolition is going to have on a building. So even if you were to demolish a building and build back a new net zero building in its place that was about the same massing and density, you're still going to have like a 60 to 80 year payback because of how much carbon you used to demolish the building and how much you threw away. And so there have been a lot of really great studies that have been done by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and a number of other organizations. I think Rocky Mountain Institute and New Buildings Institute have also done different studies to look at that. And that's something that I know the ZNCC has been working with, or rather Larry Strain and Laurie Ferris and Aaron McDade of Architecture 2030 and Goody Clancy and Siegel Strain. They've been developing a calculator to really look at that and help communicate that better. Because Carl Elefante is often quoted as being the one who said that the greenest building is the one that already exists.
Right.
But for a long time, people were like, okay, well, prove it. And so now there are more tools to help prove that and help make that case.
Right. Well, and I think that embodied energy and embodied carbon sort of value of preserving existing buildings is one that really does resonate more and more with the Passive House community, and I think retrofits are top of mind for sure. And so I think that's a way where there's a real, I think, obvious kind of harmony between Passive House practitioners and preservationists. where there can be frustration. I think going back to kind of that architect's view of preservation is the frustration of having to jump through hoops or to meet regulations and restrictions on design around preservation. And so one of the so I think that when I think preservation and passive house, one of the first things that comes to mind are things like the simulated double hung window. It looks like a double hung window. It will get past the preservation rules, but it can be high performing, and it's can be passive house. So, but I also recognize as I was listening to your podcast, how that's only like a sliver of preservation and what preservation is about. And there's also this much bigger piece of it that you're exploring around preservation and history, and the history that we tell, and what and how that's tied up in race and inequity. Could you share a little bit about that element of your work?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I've been intrigued by is kind of the vantage point of history and whose story is being told. And a lot of this came to light from a couple different projects that I've worked on, but one of them is also the Menokin project. Menokin was the home to Francis Lightfoot Lee and Rebecca Taylor, his wife. It's in Warsaw, Virginia. Francis Lightfoot Lee was one of the Virginia signers of the Declaration of Independence. And I got to start working on that plantation house back when I was working at my older company. And so one of the things I really appreciated about that foundation was that they were already telling the full story. So I didn't have to come in and be like, hey, this is a plantation house. Why are we only talking about the people who lived in the big house? And plantations don't work without the slave cabins and the slave quarters and all the people who work to make the plantation work. And so really realizing that so often we're focused on who lived in the big house and not acknowledging all of the things that had to go in to make the big house actually function, the people and the lives, and also like the reality of it and the horrors of a plantation and people being enslaved there and all of that. So it's being more mindful that I wasn't whitewashing history and only talking about the good and not the bad. Because it's like history happened. It is what it is. And it's really just the way that we tell the history and tell more of the story is really what's going to shape what goes forward. And it's, I don't know, I got very frustrated with, and particularly with like all of the uprising or all of the cultural awareness that started happening in 2020 after George Floyd was murdered. There were a lot of my white colleagues who were like, oh my gosh, how did we get here? This isn't who we are. And there's a lot of people who are very uncomfortable. And I was like, welcome to the conversation. But this, unfortunately, is exactly who we are. This has been going on for a long time. This is nothing new, but like we need to actually talk about it and address it more so that we can actually move forward in a way that's not going to keep being like, oh my gosh, this isn't us. So all that to say, like the number of unarmed Black people who had been killed, it wasn't new. It wasn't anything that we hadn't seen before. It wasn't, I don't know, for whatever reason, George Floyd's murder was a turning point. And I'm grateful that it was a turning point, but it's still unfortunate that it had to get that far. So, and not to even like, not stay on too much longer, but just kind of like the fact that it was like, George Floyd reminded me of Tamir Rice, reminded me of Trayvon Martin, of Rodney King, of Emmett Till. Like it's nothing new. And so it was just interesting to see so many of my white colleagues being like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. It's like, cool, where have you been? But thanks for showing up and let's keep going forward. So anyways, I was trying to like, I see the telling of history and the being honest of what's happening as a way to help people realize, yeah, this is going on. Because otherwise there's this ignorance that we keep perpetuating if we don't actually tell the full story of what's happened. Yeah,
I do remember that phrase of "this is not who we are" a lot, and it rightly being called out as you describe. Well, thank you for sharing that, and it's I I'm looking forward to listening to many more episodes of the podcast and learning more specifics, because you do dive into some of the specific ways that focus on including the full history of American history and preservation, how that's being manifest like physically in the world now.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that excites me about this moment, particularly in the preservation field, is that I think at first there was this fear that if we actually told the truth about what happened, that somehow it would make a place less special, or maybe it would upset the wrong people. But it's like, history is the palimpsest. It always has been. And so being able to actually tell many of the narratives and the layers that have happened in a particular place just strengthens the story. I don't think it has to take away from it, because you're making space at the table. And there's this great quote by, I think it was a historian, who basically said something along the lines of, for so long, history has been seen as a spotlight on one character. And now we're turning up the house lights and seeing the full cast. We're seeing the orchestra. We're seeing everyone who's there to actually see who's been there. So I think that just preservation has that power. And it's it's a unique position and a unique field to be able to do that, because we're able to tell more of the full story.
So I know that you wanted to dive into some of the impact of design on performance, and kind of that there, to recognizing that there was kind of a real understanding in architecture back in the day about that.
Yes.
Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And so one of the things that I love about Passive House, so when I was going through the CPHC training, I remember being surprised at how in depth we were getting into building science. And I loved it, because I think as architects, we forgot a lot of things once air conditioning became ubiquitous. Once we were thinking, okay, you know what, we can hermetically seal our buildings. We don't have to worry about overhangs because people aren't opening windows anymore. So we can have these very modern, ribbon windows, concrete structures, all that. And so it's interesting how our design and architecture evolves with technology, and architecture is very much of the time and place and technology available. But I think because of that, architects forgot a lot of things. And even, things like, let's not do so many thermal breaks in our buildings. Let's make sure we're insulating the walls well. So there are a lot of things that I think Passive House is bringing back into the design profession and making architects think about more critically, more carefully. And so it's one of the things where I'm excited that Passive House as a rating system exists. I went through the CPHC training after being a lead professional for many, many years. And it's different. It was much more intense than I was expecting, but it was amazing. And so, I'm excited that there's just this building science is coming back to the fore within design, within sustainable circles. That makes me really excited.
Yeah, it reminds me of, there was a recent presentation at Passive House Accelerator Live about a cool new building in Portland that was needing to meet some historic design guidelines in order to be approved. And the observation from the architect was, a lot of what is being required of us were smart design moves that were made, in the 1920s when the surrounding buildings were being built. So it actually went really hand in hand with creating a high performance building. Even though, so it was fun to hear about that kind of sort of seemingly accidental confluence there or connection, but actually not accidental at all. That was what design was about, was to figure out how to make them comfortable and
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Because when you couldn't rely on, air conditioning to keep you cool, you need to make sure you had overhangs on your windows to keep the sun out. And, you needed to make sure you could keep water off the facade so you could actually open the windows. So you had a little bit more ornamentation. So you had ways of water to get off the building. So it's a number of things that are coming full circle, which is exciting.
Yeah, definitely. So and another theme I know you wanted to touch upon was how Passive House and preservation can be more and more aligned. in making high performance buildings? Like, is there, but yeah, what?
Yeah. And so one of the things that I think New York does this, or the New York Historic Commission or Landmarks Commission does this better, I think, than other state historic preservation offices or SHPOs in the country, in terms of letting historic windows look like they're historic, but they're actually casement windows or tilt and turn windows that actually have a tighter seal. And so a lot of times preservation regulations are really regulating what a building looks like, not necessarily how a building performs. And so there are some instances where there are things that can be done to a historic building that is going to improve the performance, but it's not necessarily going to change the aesthetics of it. And so, solar panels and all are something that are typically allowed now to be able to be installed on historic buildings, as long as you're not going to be able to see the solar panels from certain vantage points. And so I think there's definitely a way for a lot of the passive principles to be entertained or to be accommodated into historic buildings. But then it is also like that balance, particularly when you're dealing with a masonry structure, for instance, that you can't insulate on the exterior because you can't change how it looks in the exterior. Insulating on the interior may be more difficult because of leasing requirements, or there could be some historic interior elements that you can't change. So that's where you have to be a little bit more creative of how can we actually make this building still perform.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do we then work together in the organizations that we're part of, in the preservation world, and the passive house world, and the high performance world, in the zero carbon world? What do you think are the opportunities for us to work together to facilitate these dual goals?
Yeah. So I think part of it is, I guess, kind of beginning from the recognition that we're all on the same side. I think a lot of times, and it goes both ways. So a lot of times there are preservationists who, when they hear sustainability, their eyes glaze over. They don't think it's applicable to what they're doing. Or there are sustainability folks who don't understand how existing buildings play into the climate action conversation. So it's realizing that we're both on the same side. Both, in my mind, sustainability and preservation are both about the future, because we're both trying to make sure, on the sustainability high performing side, we're trying to make sure that future generations are able to live their best lives without being as encumbered with, all of the carbon and gunk that we're sending forward. And then from a preservation standpoint, the whole reason we preserve things is because we want to make sure that there are things from our past that future generations have access to as well. So for me, they're both about the future. And so I think starting from that vantage point helps at least the conversation. It becomes more of a friendly conversation as opposed to one that's adversarial. The next thing is more so from on the preservation side, is having a better understanding of the requirements and the protections that are on a historic building. So for instance, if a building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, you still have lots of options of how you can treat that building. It's really going to depend on the funding source. There are plenty of existing buildings that are historic buildings that are on the National Register that have been torn down because they are not using any federal or state money. But when you're going after historic tax credits, or if you're in a historic district or a landmark building, then there are different requirements that need to happen. And then it's just really just having conversations and negotiating with the state historic preservation officer or office to get an understanding of what's really the important historic elements that need to be retained and preserved or restored, so we can actually do the other work that we need to do. Because when we're making a building more sustainable, a lot of times it's not going to impact the aesthetics, because we're thinking of, okay, how do we improve the insulation? Windows are often the thing where that's always that's the struggle potentially. Yeah. But it's like, are there storm window options that we could do, interior or exterior storms? Are there simulated divided lights that we could potentially do? So there are other pieces to negotiate. But a lot of times it's the insulation, it's the windows, it's the thermal breaks, and having a better understanding of how those work together. And a lot of times, if you're able to improve insulation without impacting the aesthetics of the building, then it's not going to be an issue with the historic commission or the historic district.
Right. And I can see, boy, maybe you are building an entire career around guiding teams to navigate that, and also think about the building science of, okay, so what happens when you're making those interventions, and how do you, the last thing you want to do is make a high performing historic renovation that then undermines the building in the first place. So, and fortunately we have a lot of science to draw on to make sure that doesn't happen.
Right, exactly. Making sure that we're being mindful of condensation, so we're not creating mold risks for people who are going to be occupying the building after you change how you insulate the building. So it's all of the science and the aesthetics, but it all works together, which is, it's fun. I will preface this with I'm a big nerd, so I'm enjoying all of it.
Yes, we are a community of nerds, aren't we? Yeah. So this is amazing, Nakita. What is coming next for, I guess, both the Zero Net Carbon collaboration? I mean, where do you see that headed, or where do you want to see that go as an organization? So maybe we start with that, but I also want to,
sure.
I'm curious to hear you talk about where you're headed.
Gotcha. All right. So starting with, the Zero Net Carbon collaboration, so ZNCC, that came about a couple of years ago at Association for Preservation Technology Conference, or APT, because it was back when Carl Elefante was president of the American Institute of Architects, and he's also a preservationist. And so there are a number of different sustainable-minded preservation architects in the same room, realizing that there were a number of organizations that were trying to address existing buildings, greening existing and historic buildings, and climate action, and realizing that there weren't enough intersections or connections across all of these different organizations. And so that's where the ZNCC was formed from. So it was the idea that APT, AIA, RAIC, which is the Organization for Architects in Canada, as well as US ICOMOS and a couple other organizations, would get together to share what's happening and keep people in the loop. That's evolved. And so that's what we also then connected with Passive House Accelerator, as well as Carbon Leadership Forum, New Buildings Institute, because there are so many different siloed things that are happening around the industry that need to just share more. And so that's one of the things we're excited about for ZNCC, where we're really aiming to curate information that's out there already, collaborate with lots of the organizations, communicate what's happening, and then create things and fill in holes where we see missing in terms of case studies or anything like that. And so working with the organizations and being able to also get guidance from the organizations, like I know Passive House Accelerator is also on the steering committee for ZNCC, and being able to have conversations about how do we keep the industry moving forward, and how do we keep talking and getting out of our silos, so that we have the architects talking to the preservationists, talking to the building science folks, and we're all getting to the same point where we're realizing that building reuse is climate action. And the Climate Heritage Network has been also a great facilitator in that globally. So it's been really fun talking to people in different industries, different sectors, and different parts of the world about how do we reuse our heritage buildings. So it's been really fun. And so ultimately, I think for ZNCC, we'd really just love to keep the conversation going and keep getting more people on the same page to realize that, hey, we have a lot of existing and historic buildings to work with. Let's start there and make them as green as they can be, so we can get closer to net zero and a carbon zero future.
Right on. And I thank you for inviting the accelerator to be involved. And I feel we're just getting started, and I'm just super excited about the effort. So that's good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what about you? What is next for you?
So I'm not quite sure. It's an exciting time. As I'm enjoying being at Quinn Evans, and I'm getting a lot of space to grow and learn, and getting really fun projects. I get to work on a wide scale of projects. So from like renovating 38 row homes that have been vacant in Baltimore for the past 30 years to working on like Baltimore Penn Station. There's a good mix of projects that are happening in there.
Yeah.
But then I'm also really excited about the podcast, and there's a number of fun and exciting podcast things coming up later this year. And it's a really great reason to just keep talking to people and being curious, which is something I'm enjoying doing. I also realize I know a lot of really interesting people that don't often get asked to share their story or their knowledge. And so I'm excited to be able to keep bringing that to the world.
Yeah, must be rewarding work.
Yeah, it's a good time.
Well, Nakita, I know that you have a lot going on. I'm so happy to have been able to chat with you, and I'm really excited to share this conversation with the Passive House community. Thanks for being here.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me. It's been very exciting to be on this side of the microphone, because I'm often sitting in on so many of the other things that are happening, and enjoying the different happy hours and beer o'clocks and things that are happening on the accelerator. So I'm grateful for all of the work that you guys are doing over there, and I'm excited that more people are getting involved.
Great. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks. This is awesome.
And that was Nakita Reed of various, as so many of our guests seem to be these days, involved in so many different things. I just got so much out of that, Zach. What a fantastic interview. Like I said at the start, I feel quite inspired and invigorated listening to Nakita. So passionate and so enthusiastic, so intelligent as well, and really insightful. Starting from the top, can architecture save the world, do you think?
Yeah,
that's a big question.
That's a good question. Architecture can be part of saving the world. Absolutely. It needs to be part of saving the world. There's no saving the world without architecture. How about that?
I really like that vision of small, young Nakita making that connection between a homeless person sitting in front of an abandoned building and just that childhood simplicity of seeing a problem that is kind of obvious, but then growing into the maturity of in her words, saying it's more complicated than that. And it is, but it isn't, it doesn't have to be that complicated. And then sure, there are complications of the society and the rules and everything that we have to learn and live by. But I feel like Nakita has kind of held on to that early idea and just set about fixing or overcoming some of those complications.
Yeah, I mean, there's a direct through line from that story of her childlike kind of, grappling with this and wonder about why this is going on, and understanding that people need buildings and buildings need people. There's a direct line from that to what she's working on right now, where with she mentioned at the end of the conversation, her the renovation work, that effort to renovate 30 some townhomes that have been abandoned for 30 years, and I think there's this recognition of what abandoned buildings do to a neighborhood and the impact that those empty buildings have on people. It's not just as simple as an empty building. There's all sorts of symbolism and story wrapped up in that abandonment and the emptiness of those buildings that can be a real, I think, a challenge to neighborhoods. And so that work becomes then of revitalizing them becomes one of really breathing new energy and vitality into those communities. So pretty cool that she's making that real.
Yeah, she is making it real. And there are two parallel, it was probably more than two, but a couple of parallel streams that I really pick up on there is that cultural aspect of the historical influence of buildings. But then there's also the technical scientific aspect. And I hadn't really considered or appreciated the science of preservation. When previously I thought preservation, the idea of preserving a historic building was more in the artistic side of things, of the beauty or the vernacular of the building, the way it looks. But the way Nakita was talking, literally they do science experiment. She's talking about being in the white lab coats and pouring different things, seeing how old materials respond. She kind of brushed over, but the big issue of upgrading existing buildings is what to do with moisture. And if you insulate a building that wasn't previously insulated, that can really lead to condensation issues. So there is a real science in doing that, but weaving in the historical implications of any particular building at the same time can be hugely powerful. And I think she obviously does that really well. And she's so sensitive to it, but sensitive in a positive way. I was really taken by the way she characterized her experience as a Black female professional architect in America, or in the world, really. And she just kept using she used a couple of times, she used the word privilege. And she saw what she described as a unique viewpoint as a privilege. And I just thought, wow, that is such a powerful thing. How would that translate to my own life of the things that I think about as being a challenge, and flip it around and said, well, this is a privilege of having the viewpoint that I have.
Grappling with what came to a head, I guess, or just was sort of vaulted more into white people's consciousness in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, and then weaving that into her professional work and making her professional work part of move toward justice. And I mean, it's powerful stuff. And I think that's what's part of so cool. What is so cool speaking with Nakita is just, seeing that embodied and seeing what that power is allowing her to do in the world, and it's being recognized too, which is nice. I'm sure that just feels like, kind of window dressing compared to the essence of the work for her. But she has become something of a star in the design community, and rightly so. And it's that seeing somebody with that kind of purpose and applying that in creative and productive and exciting ways, it's good to see.
One of the first things she said is that people need buildings and buildings need people.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we can talk about moisture, and we can talk about air tightness, we can talk about insulation levels and glazing. But at the end of the day, the purpose of building buildings is to allow people to live, work, and play in a good environment. So I am really enthused and, like I said, quite invigorated by hearing those stories and hearing the work that Nakita's involved with.
Yeah, me too. Well said.
The other thing that jumps out at me is what I would call back to the future in terms of design. I've done a presentation in the past where I bring up images of first settler cottages in colonial Australia or New Zealand, and I've done this as well put up a presentation of a picture that I got one of my kids to draw when they were 5 years old of a house. And a classic 5-year-old picture of a house with its pitched roof and its one window and door, maybe a chimney.
Yeah.
It's actually really, really good design because it has all the elements of a well-designed house, like a pitched roof and eaves and a small window. And we can learn quite a lot from the function that drove the form of historical buildings before we kind of got lazy and just let mechanical services provide everything, and then we didn't have to worry about eaves or windows that were going to just let all the sun in or the heat out. So I quite like that recognition that while we've got modern technology, we've also got the benefit of hindsight when we look at some of historic buildings.
Yeah, and that we can then use that as a lesson as we move forward. Like, how do we? So if that's the case, then how does our practice change as we go to different climates and all that? It's super interesting.
Yeah. Well, I had a whole heap of notes. We could probably carry on all day, but we should probably move on and just recommend that people go and check out Nakita's own podcast.
Yes, definitely. We'll include a link to that in show notes. It's really, I've gone through a few episodes so far, and I'm looking forward to listening to much more. It's really great stuff.
So that's Tangible Remnants.
That's right.
And people can find that on certainly on Apple, but probably other platforms as well. So check that out. If that interview is anything to go by, I'm sure it'd be a great series worthwhile. Awesome.
Indeed.
Well, that was very cool. What have we got coming up? What events are happening?
Well, we have a special event with Lloyd Alter, who is the author with Tree Hugger, and he just wrote a book called Living the 1.5 Degree Lifestyle. And so we're having a special event on Tuesday, March 29th. So that'll be Wednesday, March 30th for you in New Zealand and Australia. With Lloyd Alter, he's going to be sharing insights from his book and excerpts, and then that'll be followed with by a discussion with some special guests that evening. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So I hope that we'll see folks there on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday at Passive House Accelerator Live. So this is Thursday your time. We're joined by Daniel Kress, who's going to be talking about does Passive House cost the world, or does it save it? So he's diving into his calculations around the cost of single family passive house, ways to understand that, ways to communicate about it, and simple moves that sort of like a simple incentive, a governmental incentive that could dramatically lessen the cost burden. So it's great. It should be great. I think we've had Daniel on the podcast, and then also at Construction Tech before. So he's very entertaining. We're looking forward to that.
Absolutely.
And lots of other stuff going on in the community. We'll have details of that in show notes.
Very good. All right. Hey, well, thank you for that. We're a little bit late with our recording schedule this week, but it was well worth it. So thank you for making that time with Nakita. I look forward to catching up with some of her podcasts as well. Awesome. All right. Well, that's a wrap for this week. We'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, check out all the great resources on the Passive House Accelerator website, and don't forget to subscribe, leave a rating or review if you can as well. It helps get the word out. Thank you very much for listening in. We'll catch you up next week on the Passive House podcast.
Feel better, Matthew.
Thank you.